Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to be talking you through an important part of research methods called the features of science. I've split this video up into two in order to kind of make it accessible to you, and hopefully it will give you something to think about between the two different videos. Now, the features of science comes into a part of research methods where they can expect us to kind of write a content-based answer. This is not an applied answer to a kind of research method question, a design, calculation, or any of those types of things. So it is a section that you should be revising like you would revise for any other content-based part of the course. So a couple of things that you might want to know is that each of the subheadings, so for example, this one, objectivity, is part of the feature of science. And I know that there's also a bigger question you should be asking is kind of whether psychology is a science. And therefore, we kind of have a simple answer to say, yes, it is, because we use the features of science. I also hope that you can appreciate that maybe psychology has kind of elements that are kind of different from your core sciences, such as chemistry, biology, physics, and that in many ways, psychology is able to achieve kind of a bit more than just simply objectivity. So, of course, going through this particular content, the first thing you can kind of realize is, of course, that your core sciences, as I said, physics and chemistry, are seen as being objective, and mostly because they use something called quantitative data. So therefore, in terms of psychology, you could ask and answer the question and say, okay, so which part of psychology is most scientific in terms of objectivity? And that would, of course, be experiments. So that's why I say objectivity can be achieved if we go through some kind of systematic collection of data. And the way we can do this is through a lab experiment. And that is why it's obviously important for us to be able to understand what an IV is and how we manipulate it in order to observe something which we call a DV. So objectivity is achieved via this way. Now, of course, what we need to also recognize is that because this is content, we can also ask questions about it, we can also challenge it. And I quite like this kind of quote from Popper, who says that science is not totally objective, okay? Is not totally objective because every person that does science has beliefs, preferences, and interests that potentially will influence them. So even though the core sciences often kind of try and convince us that they are more believable because of the objectivity, Popper would say that the people in it lead to bias, and perhaps kind of why psychology in itself is great, because we acknowledge this. We do understand that we have people as part of our experiment. So it says here, in psychological experiment may be a social situation, and so therefore objectivity is difficult to achieve because of that, and we're kind of happy to accept that. And in terms of research methods, we would refer to these social situations as having demand characteristics, where people kind of act unnaturally in order to kind of tell us about what they think that we are looking for. And we see that both Ash and Milgram, we have social situations there where we're trying to understand human behavior. And we can always, that's why we question those particular pieces of research to kind of say if the Confederates weren't believable, then potentially that's not ideal, because in terms of objectivity, it's not ideal, but in terms of actually collecting data, it's not ideal. So there we go. The first feature of science is objectivity. Now, I'm going to give you a question that came up a couple of years ago in the exam. And the reason I'm going to do this now, and also with the expectation that you can come back and look at this once we covered more of the features of science, is that it kind of shows us several things. So if you read through this, and you might need to pause the video in order to read through it, we see that the main question says, explain why the teacher's personal opinion cannot be accepted as scientific evidence. So why personal opinion cannot be accepted as scientific evidence. Okay, but I suppose what is key here is that 6 marks. The idea that this question is a substantial question. It's something which can change your grade. So we need to take these topics, this content seriously. So just going back to the scenario, we see one of the things that we need to focus on. It says, in her opinion, children who eat a decent breakfast learn to read more quickly and are better behaved than children who do not. And so one of the things you could literally do is understand what the question is asking us to do. It's asking us to look at this particular statement and try and understand kind of what is less scientific about this and kind of why that is important. And so, of course, this was a question we kind of had a look at in class. And many of you kind of picked up on like the phrase a decent breakfast. What is a decent breakfast? It's not something that has actually ultimately been objectified in terms of we can understand what it is. It also says this idea of reading more quickly and better behaved. That's also something that may well be subjective. But we also see that she works within the same school, and so therefore she's not looking at other things. She also hasn't corroborated any of her evidence in terms of eating a healthy breakfast, and as such, she is kind of performing lots of errors in this. So I'm just going to show you part of the mark scheme to highlight some of the things that they had a look at. They got the one school. They also have a look at that. There's some sampling issues because it's a limited number of 5-year-olds. The corroborative evidence, like even, that in itself is a social situation, because if you ask the children, they simply, might not realize that they have actually had a breakfast or a decent breakfast. And parents might not want you to know that they send their children to school without a decent breakfast. We see the vague phrases that we referred to, which haven't been operationalized. And of course, ultimately, the evidence being fairly flimsy, and she's not used a method. She hasn't got any controlled study. She hasn't used the empirical method in this. And so there you see that this particular question is particularly challenging at 6 marks, something you have to spend some time in the exam answering. But of course, you could look at mark schemes like this and kind of see what it is that they're looking for. And of course, follow the subheading. So the next subheading is that empirical method, kind of this whole idea, that this controlled idea. So what we do say is that a characteristic of science is this idea of empirical methods of observation and measurement. So ultimately, everything starts with an observation, but we need to make observations and make measurements, and these need to come from our experiences and not from our opinion. So we see here it must be based on evidence. So direct observation is good evidence, or direct experience or measurement is also seen as an important process in terms of empirical method, and that's kind of what we say, that research or scientific research is a collection of this particular information through direct testing. The third feature, and this is a feature that they seem to kind of like to ask in the exams, is this idea of replicability. And I suppose part of us is just making sure that we can check our findings. It's very important for us to use this, because in our evaluation phrases, I often say there's research support. And what I'm saying is that people have done research and collected data that kind of supports what we're looking for, and that's a form of replicability. And it says that ensure that they are robust. In other words, they stand up to what others' expectations are and our expectations are. So once again, lab experiments are really good for us in terms of replicability. And of course, we can see if the outcomes are the same, then that is an important part of the scientific process. So we see here, this is probably quite a good definition of replicability, is saying that replicability is the ability to check and verify scientific information. And we see that there's a couple of kind of conditions to this. You need to have all the details must be included in your write-up. And so when we go back to that previous section where we're looking at the content of what goes into a report, we see that actually writing up the procedure and writing up the experimental design and things like that is not just a waste of our time. It's in order to help the scientific process so that other people can potentially replicate our work. So a typical question or question that they like to ask is something like this. It says, explain what is meant by replicability and why is it an important feature of science? And we see once again kind of a significant amount of marks. Now, of course, research methods is a section where they like to have definitive answers. And so we actually see that the next part in your notes is literally cut and paste from a mark scheme. And this is talking about how answering the second part, kind of why is replicability an important feature of science? Okay, and we see there's a number of things there. We see at the bottom here it says unrepeatable results may imply flaws or lack of control within the method used, and so we become kind of attuned to some of the language that they look at. But what I also like about this scientific process is it starts talking about hypotheses, and we'll see over the next few kind of subtopics or kind of headings that there's this kind of focus on kind of trying to figure things out, trying to show kind of whether we can actually show cause and effect and things like that. I just want to kind of point out to you, though, that this is not the whole answer, because there's still the first part of the question that says, explain what is meant by replicability. And so therefore, literally kind of copy part of the previous kind of paragraph in order to answer that. So now we start getting to things that are slightly more kind of theoretical and asking kind of questions about psychology as a science and about science as a whole. So the fourth feature of science is this idea of falsifiability, and this comes from Popper again. And you might have wondered why we potentially even have to develop hypotheses, and it's because of this whole need of science in order to try and show cause and effect. And Popper started to question the value of proof, and he said that what we need to consider is that what is the best tool in terms of science is the ability to disprove something, or the ability to falsify something. And he gives quite a classic example. So this idea that I can observe a white swan. Every time I go to a lake or to a river, I can observe a white swan, and I could even formulate some kind of logical inductive process where I say, this one is white, and then I go and observe another swan, and that's white, and another swan, and that's white, and therefore say all swans are white. But that process, even though it may well be true, and the scientific objectivity and cause and effects of the situation may well be true, what Popper would like us to be reminded of is that it takes one black swan in order to disprove any form of theory or theorizing about all swans being white. And that, for us, is quite important, because it may well be that we do observe 1,000 swans and we never in our lives view a black swan. But of course, a black swan in itself, or they are real, may actually totally disprove us. So that's falsifiability. Now, of course, this is something that you might then say, well, what about people in psychology, such as Freud, that can't be tested, so can never be tested objectively, and so therefore will always remain non-falsifiable. So falsifiability is about kind of that scientific process, but of course we know that some parts of psychology is not always falsifiable. We then have the next topic, which is theory construction. And I have messed up because I meant to have done this in two parts, and I'm going to do theory construction in the next video. Thank you.